everyone. I'm Erica. I'm joined by Audrey from Perpetual Pages, and we are going to discuss their favorite book. And I will tell you how this came about after Audrey introduces themselves.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Adri. I am a queer, trans, non-binary Mexican American book reviewer, writer, and YouTuber. And as Erica said, my channel is Perpetual Pages. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about Cemetery Boys because it's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Cemetery Boys.
Yeah, I have mine too.
I I have one lonely tab in here, but it's
I have
okay.
many.
I have lots of highlights. I like ran out of tabs and refused to go to the store and get some, so but I
That's
have
valid.
highlights. Anyway, so I asked Audrey last year, end of last year, even though I knew I didn't have to, but I asked anyway, what their favorite book of 2020 was.
Mhm.
And to my surprise, they said Cemetery Boys. And the reason why I asked is because I was asking people, booktubers, people that I work with, and people that I know from Instagram, what their least and their favorite books of 2020 were, because I wanted to read them to see if I felt the same way. The project was a huge failure for me, but I did read some good books and I did read a few not so good books, but that's to be expected. Not everybody's going to have the same taste. But I will have to say, I understand 100% why Cemetery Boys is Audrey's favorite book. I understand it 100%. So, we're going to talk about it. And I do see, and we're going to talk about like how I see some crossovers from is it the Latinx community and the Black community?
Mhm.
Um, because I don't think that this is a book strictly geared to one community.
Right.
Um, and I think it has broad appeal. And having said that, I definitely think more people need to read it.
100%.
So I'm gonna let Audrey take the reins and give just a summation, if you will. Yeah, summation.
Sure. So, in case you haven't read it yet, Cemetery Boys is written by Aiden Thomas, who is a queer and trans Latina author. And it's about a character named Gabriel, who's also queer, trans, and Latina. He's Mexican and Cuban American. And he is trying to prove to his family that he is a brujo because he lives in this world that is made up of magic, where everyone is either, because in his community, you're either a brujo or a bruja, and they have very specific magical abilities. And because he's trans, his family doesn't believe that he can just choose to be a brujo. They believe that he was born with a certain kind of magic and either he uses it or he doesn't. So he wants to prove to them that he actually is a brujo, but they won't let him go through with his quinces ceremony. So when his cousin mysteriously disappears and every brujo is on deck, he realizes this is his chance to shine. So he decides to take matters into his own hands and perform his quince ceremony on his own so that he can finally prove that he is able to summon spirits and help his family and help his community. But when he tries to summon his cousin's spirit, he accidentally summons the spirit of Julian Diaz, who is kind of like the token bad boy at his
Mhm.
school.
Yeah.
And they have to um, and then they have to figure out what happened to Julian on top of figuring out what happened to Gabriel's cousin. And it just becomes this whole adventure, this whole chaotic mystery, choose your own adventure type thing. And
Yeah.
it's very fun. It's paranormal and it's really wonderful. Just, I'm going to stop before I keep going on. It's just wonderful.
It's okay. I mean, we will go on.
We will go on.
We will go on. Who was your favorite character or characters?
um, I feel like that's I feel like I have kind of a cop out answer because my favorite character is Yadiel because I just identified with him so much. And I think that's really interesting because we don't have like a 100% connection as humans. Like our experiences are not completely the same.
Mhm.
Like I was just thinking about this earlier. Like he's a teenager. I'm not. He's Cuban and Mexican American. I'm just Mexican American. He's a binary trans boy, at least as far as we know in the text. And I am
Mhm.
a non-binary trans person, though I am trans masc and he is trans masc as well. So there's a lot of ways that our experiences are different, but there was just so much about him
Mhm.
that I recognized just like human to human. And I think there was so much about his experience as a trans masc Latina person that I had never read before in a book. Even something as simple as just like the fact that he wears a binder. That was
Mhm.
an experience that I had as well that I had never read in a book. So there's just all these little things about him and his family and his community and his culture on top of the fact that he's trans that
Mhm.
I had never gotten to read before. So I think that's why I identify with him the most strongly, even though our experiences aren't necessarily the same.
Yeah. And forgive my ignorance, but when I first started reading it and I read Binder,
Mm,
I did
you
not
thought like
know.
a
Yeah. I was like, what? And I was like, okay, this is my cishet ignorance at play
Mhm.
here, not knowing. And so I went down, I went down the rabbit hole of looking. I was like, oh, and then
Mhm.
like looking at like what goes on and what the process is and things like that for that. And I was like, oh, got it. Got
Yeah.
it. Now I can go on into the text. And I read this because we were going to originally do this, what, in April, March or April?
Yeah, like
Something
March or
like that.
April. Yeah.
And then life for both of us happened.
Hmm.
And then we rescheduled it, and then life happened again.
Yep.
So here we are. And I'm glad. I'm like excited to talk about it, to be honest, because it's so much
It is so
in this
much.
little book,
Hmm.
and I'm really quite appreciative of it. So I will say, I love
Hmm.
Maritza.
Oh, yes.
She reminds me a lot of me. I identified with her
Mm-hmm.
100% because she's super sassy. And she says what is on her mind. There's like no real filter.
Hmm.
And that is a problem that I have 100%. I like the way she says that, she saved his ass.
Hmm.
And she says it proudly and like with, I saved your ass and you owe me.
Oh, yes.
And I will never let you live this down kind of thing. And you
Yeah.
know that she won't. I loved Julian as well. So I was just like, he's over the top, but I
I love
really
him.
love
Yeah,
him.
I mean, he's canonically ADHD, I believe. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. I love that that part of him is almost celebrated in the story as well
Hmm.
because his energy and his charisma and his sort of like off the wall, sporadic personality is part of what helps them get to where they need to be. So
Yeah.
he's like the perfect addition to the crew. So I love that his, like I said, his ADHD and just his personality and his charisma and all of that is
Yeah.
centered and celebrated in the story instead of being like he's a burden and he's in the way. Like, no, he arguably is what makes the story the story.
Yeah. And I even notated in my book when he was just like going on and on and on, I was like ADHD.
Yep.
And um I thought and then I was like, okay, is he ever as a ghost, is he gonna calm down?
Never.
And he did not.
Never.
And oh, fair warning, there will be spoilers. And if you haven't read the book, please feel free to save this
Yes.
and read the book if you don't want
And
spoilers,
come
and
back.
then come back. Um, and just to let you know, I am not going to put up spoiler alert because it's probably just going to happen organically.
Yeah.
So, but I also, Yadriel, loved him.
Love him.
And that he was like, I gotta go to school.
Yes.
Then we can do this. I love the priority
Hmm.
that that he had. And then like the end, and we'll get to that part. The end where they're driving around and
Oh
they
yeah.
go to the bonfire and that whole thing. That I don't cry, I don't well up at books, but that part and another part, like literally. had me like crying.
Yeah.
It had me in an emotional state. So when that happens, the author for me has done their job
Yeah.
100%. So, anyway,
Can I ask something?
yes.
Yeah. So I have a question for you because obviously I know why the story resonates for me, but I'm curious to know why it resonates for you. Because to give people a little like peek behind the curtain, I think it was you had just started reading it. And I want to say like you had read maybe one or two chapters and you like immediately came into my DMs like, Adri, we need to talk about this book.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know like what was it that like immediately hooked you and resonated for you throughout the story?
Um, the familial connection,
Mm,
for one, but I think it was when what really hit me was when I found out that Yadriel's mom had passed.
mm,
And actually, no one knows this, but my mom passed earlier this year. So, and I think that's the thing that started to resonate with me, and that like really pulled me in because, what is it? What's the ceremony called?
They call it colloquially, they refer to it as like a quinces.
Yeah, but it's what happens on the 31st
Oh,
of
the oh
um,
God, aquilade.
yeah. So when I was reading that, and I was just like, okay, that's I think what started it with me when
Mm-hmm,
they were saying that his mom would come back and they would be able to talk for a couple days and spend some time. And
mm-hmm,
I think it was just really fresh
mm-hmm.
for me, um, because at the time my mom had not passed, but it was happening.
Right.
So, um, yeah, I think that's what it was. That, and then how, the community came together or comes together on a regular basis to
Right.
take care of their own, and just, people, family calling us, and, church members calling and stopping by and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so I think that was one of the things that resonated, or the beginning. But then as I
Right.
was reading, I was just like, okay, Black people do this too. This is not just, solely this
Mm-hmm.
one community.
Right.
So, and that's why I say that I think it should definitely be read more widely and
Mm-hmm.
broadly,
Yeah.
because it's just not a Latinx book.
Yeah, I do want to kind of go back to what you were talking about in terms of like the community, because I think that's something, and the culture as well. I think that's something that a lot of non-Latina readers connect with. I think, especially like you were talking about how the story kind of deals with death, not necessarily as like as the end of a life, but as a continuation and something that is like celebrated in a really beautiful way instead of necessarily feared. So I think that's something a lot of non-Latina readers connect with when they read Cemetery Boys. And I think it's really important because I think it's a very comforting idea of death, right? That like,
Yeah.
even though you're gone, as long as you're remembered, you
Mhm.
are in so many ways still alive. And that there's still so much that can be celebrated
Mhm.
from life, even after it has technically ended. So yeah, I think that is something I see a lot of non-Latina readers connecting with in the story. So I think you were totally right in touching on that. And then also, like you said, the sort of like multi-generational, like very connected community that's in the story. I think that's really special. That's an element that a lot of people don't even really understand or even talk about when they talk about Cemetery Boys, but it's something that really stood out for me because as a Latina person, our communities are very multi-generational,
Mhm.
very connected. So like it's not even like unusual to have like multi-generational households, for example,
Yeah.
which is something that Yadriel actually has
Yeah.
himself because he's living with his dad and his brother, his nuclear family, and then his grandmother is living with him as well. And then, like you said, people from his community just sort of like pop in all the time. So it's like
Time.
whether they're his like tias and tios or whether they're just like friends of the family, other people in the Brujex community, they're just
Mhm.
there all the time. They're always connected. They're always in communication with each other. And I think that is maybe not necessarily Latinx specific, but it is something that is very big in our community as well. And so I think that's something that I really connected with, that I also don't get to see it often in books. Like it's
Yeah.
often just like I said, the nuclear family, especially when we're talking about like young adult literature. So
Hmm.
to have like this like multi-generational, like multi-connected community be centered in this kind of story is a really big deal, and it's something that I think is really exciting that we should see more of.
I agree 100%. We always talk about, and especially my father, like if any of my cousins need anything or need a place to stay,
Hmm.
you know, we're here.
Yeah.
His doors are always open
Yes.
for them. And and I think that, and I don't want to say that that is, I think it is had very non-Eurocentric.
Yes.
Um, that's
Yes.
that's the best way I can put it. And I think having family around you like that also helps to keep you grounded.
Yeah.
I noticed that like right off the bat with Cemetery Boys, the multi-generational family household, and um, how the community how the community came together. Like,
Hmm.
okay, let me back up before I say that.
Yeah.
How Yadriel and Maritza felt the death of their cousin,
Right.
Miguel, right?
Yes.
And and I think that right there says a lot about familial connections and
Right.
closeness and tethers
Hmm.
for and as well. Um, and how family is so important that you know when someone is missing,
Right.
and you feel it in your spirit, you feel it in the depths of your soul.
Yeah.
I thought that the way that they wove that into the story
Hmm.
and built upon it was really amazing. And
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I think there is something really compelling about the community coming together, like you said, and having this sense of like something has happened to one of ours that should not have happened. And
mhm,
we are not going to rest until we figure out what it was and what happened to them, until we can find a way to bring that soul peace or rest or whatever. So that sort of speaks to a greater movement of trying to find healing, I guess, as a community. That's
yeah,
really powerful as well. But I also think there's an interesting, like, sort of contradiction and tension there, because I mean, we've been praising the sense of community in the story, which there definitely is. And I think it's really interesting that we have this tight knit community, this really complex community, but there's also a sense of isolation
that's my
within
next.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for Yadriel, and even for Maritza, who is a vegan bruja, which basically means that she can't really practice brujeria because it requires, I believe it's animal blood.
Animal
I think,
blood.
yeah, animal blood. And as a vegan, obviously, she doesn't vibe with that. So she doesn't use her powers. So for both of them, and obviously for Yadriel as a trans bruja who, like, no one really believes is a brujo, there is tension there because they both find themselves sort of cut off from that community.
Yep.
So there's a really interesting almost duality, I want to say, there, where they are
Yeah.
on the one hand connected to the community because they belong to it and because they're connected to it through like blood and through their family and through their genes and all that, but they are also isolated from it in the sense that their community has a very set way of doing things,
Mhm.
and they don't necessarily see how Yadriel or even how Maritza or even how Yadriel's Tío Catrice fits into it
Right.
when they don't follow those clear cut paths of like brujo, bruja, you do this kind of magic this
Mhm.
way, and that's the end of the story. So, yeah, I think there is an interesting little contradiction in there, which is what makes the story more compelling to me, at least.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the things that I was going to bring up next because it just seemed a natural flow.
Yeah,
But acceptance versus non-acceptance.
yeah.
Um, and that I have written, and that was another thing that attracted me to the book. There was a part in here where Yadriel comes back after he and Maritza do the quinces, um, and they go back to the house. They get back to the house, and his father says, "Stay here."
Mm,
It's like stay here with
the rest of the women.
stay here with the rest of the women, and I got angry.
I think that scene definitely hits people as well, whether you are trans or not, because I think you just feel the wrongness in it. And I think
Yeah,
what makes it even more heartbreaking is that you know it's not coming from a place of aggression. It's not coming from a place of hatred necessarily, because it's coming from his father. It's coming from someone who's known him his whole life and who loves
yeah.
him and who even accepts him to an extent. And I think that is what like sort of wrinkles for most people because they they feel like here's someone who has quote unquote allowed Gabriel to transition, right? His
Mhm.
father's like, I'll call you by a different name. I'll use different words for you. I'll use the pronouns you ask me to use. But in my heart of hearts, sometimes I still do not see you as a
Mhm.
man. And so
Yeah.
I think that is what non-trans readers I think are picking up during that scene. And I think that's why it sort of invokes the kind of reaction that you were talking about, that anger, that shock, because it speaks to a deeper issue that cis people still have to contend with. Because a lot of people nowadays are a little more up to par when we're talking about gender neutral terms or using the terms that somebody asks you to use or asking people their pronouns. Maybe you're a little bit more up to par on the different kinds of gender identities that exist, or maybe you are more educated on, gender expansive identities and that kind of stuff. But in society, people are still conditioned to assume man or woman on
Mhm.
site. And so, what people are not doing is they're not doing the work of degendering their minds.
Yeah.
So, because you can call someone by the name they ask you to call them by, you can use the pronouns that somebody asks you to use. You can intellectually go, oh, that person's trans, that person's non binary, that person's agender, whatever they may be. But if you're still secretly thinking of them as a woman or as a man, you're not doing the work that you need to do to be able to respect trans people as trans and to see trans people as their identities instead
Right.
of what they were born as or what you think they should be. So I think that is what's coming to the surface in that scene there is that it's really heartbreaking because this is someone who loves and supports Gabriel, but he is not perfect
Mhm.
because he still sees Gabriel as a child that he's not instead of as the boy that he actually is.
Yeah. And I will agree with that. And I personally still have a lot of work to do. And I will admit that 100%. I am learning, I'm having those conversations, and I am going down the Google hole a lot. But like you said, you have to put in the work to retrain yourself, having the binary in my head. And that's an easy thing to pound in because you've got the girls' bathroom, you've got the boys' bathroom, you've got, what are gender norms.
Mm-hmm.
And women do this, men do this. And, you know, women wear these clothes and men wear these clothes. And, you know, boys play with cars and trucks and girls play with dolls. And I think that with Yadriel's father
Mm-hmm.
saying, go into the room with the rest of the women, I think other and I'm going to play it down just a little bit for right now. I think that is part of the gender role, the gender norms. The men go out and do this. The
Right.
women stay home and do
Very
this.
much. Yeah.
And I think that in that moment, no, he wasn't thinking of him as a he, but as his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And that for some parents, they still see you as that little boy or little girl that they raised you and wanted you to be and had these expectations for you in these gender roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because I don't believe that he was being malicious.
Right.
It was just in that very moment that this is men's work and this is women's work.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I will take it to a certain point, but you are still not. And this is how I still look at you, and you're still my little baby girl, you know?
Mhm,
Even though it's wrong, um, I understood where that was coming from
mhm,
at the same time. And I hoped, and that when I read that, I had hoped that Yadriel's father, would come around to seeing him as who he wanted to be seen as and to be accepted as, and as a brujo,
mhm,
and as as a as a boy, as is that right? As a boy,
mhm.
because he's how old is he? I hate to
I think
say
it's
boy
like
like
16 or 17. Yeah,
yeah.
I know.
So
Yeah.
so as a teenage almost man.
Mhm.
Okay.
What I'm thinking about is I think it's important for trans readers who are reading that scene, especially young trans readers.
Hmm.
It's important for them to understand that Yadriel's father's reaction in that moment of misgendering him and saying, you need to stay here with the rest of the women, that's more of a reflection on him
Yeah.
than it is on Yadriel. And that just speaks to the work that he still needs to do as a
Mm.
father and as an ally, rather than a failing on Yadriel's part. And I think that's really important for young trans readers to know, especially because, like you said, a lot of parents sort of default to like, this is the way I was raised. I raised you a certain way. I still see you that way, blah, 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 blah. Parents are more than welcome to feel that, but that is their baggage. That's their
Right.
problem that they need to work through. It's not the problem of the trans child. So that's the only thing I'm thinking, is that I hope when trans readers read that scene, they realize that, like I said, it's more of a reflection on the work that Yadriel's father still needs to
Yeah.
do, because Yadriel is trans and he is enough, and he is enough from page one until
But
the end of the book. So
yeah.
that's something that I think about when I read that scene as well.
And Julian even says it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you are
Yes.
enough. He says it, and he says it on more than one occasion.
Mm-hmm.
And in spite of Julian being so out there in his ADHD world, he had a lot of really, really good points that
Yes.
he tried to get Yadriel to see and to understand. And one of the things that got me was when um, Julian said, "Are you doing this for them? Are you doing it for you?
Mm-hmm.
Are you trying to prove something to them? Are you trying to prove something to you? And that you deserve this. Are you trying to prove that you deserve to be a brujo to your community, or are you trying to prove it to yourself?" And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, not Yadriel, Julian hit the nail on the head. And because he was always, Yadriel was always talking about, I have to prove this, I have to prove that. And I know at one point I even wrote or thought that, no, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
You do what you do, and let everybody else catch up to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I kept thinking. And I know it's hard not to be accepted, especially by the people that you love and that you think that love you. And that's really hard to accept that you're not accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And to look at it like you said, that is their problem.
Mm-hmm.
That is not your problem to deal with. And Yadriel said it when he said, I'm tired of forgiving. I'm tired of being the one to forgive.
Mm-hmm.
And he was angry about that. And he made a point to stay angry. And I'm thinking to myself, as well you should, because you can't let people keep disrespecting you without consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And the sooner they know that there's a consequence to their actions and or inactions, the sooner they'll come around.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, maybe, maybe,
Maybe.
let's
Maybe.
maybe. Um, but I was just like, you have every right to be angry, and you have every right to express that and to say it.
Hmm.
And I was very, very happy when Yadriel did express that. And there were so many, so many very well written passages that I just have like description written next to. And I was just like, I love, and then how I'm jumping around, sorry.
No
This
worries.
just came to my head how um, Julian was referred to or described as being like having a halo of blue.
Mm,
And I thought, because he's a lot of times when Julian is mentioned as being a ghost, there's always some mention of a shade of blue.
mm,
And I thought that was interesting. And I usually look up to see what colors mean in
mm.
literature. Blue, I'm looking it up right now. Archetype, Ar, if I can spell it. Arche. They're gonna take my degree back. Okay, that's odd because this does not embody him at all.
Oh, okay.
Julian. Calmness and peace and comfort.
Hmm. Interesting. Maybe because that's what he needs, like to
Hmm.
balance him out. And that I guess that sort of represents what Yadriel is for him, a sort of
Yeah,
balancing, sort of logistical force.
yeah. I interesting.
Interesting.
Um, because he does actually, Julian does calm down a little bit, but I'm gonna, I'm just negating what I just said. Um, I say but because some of his calming down is more that he's upset about
Hmm.
certain things
Right.
and he can't get his his point and his thoughts across, or he feels as though he can't get them across. The piece that says that blue represents, and I'm thinking about that in terms of the whole um, seeing your relatives during the ceremony
Mm,
and how they're at peace where they are, and then when you get to see them again, how you become peaceful or at peace. No, I guess knowing that they're at peace
right.
um, with that, and how you're happy or how they are happy that their relatives are not in any pain or not suffering anymore. So there's that sense of peace as
Hmm.
well. And I thought it was interesting how um, Julian, the first time he flickered in and out, and that Yajiao could see the blood on his chest
Mm,
when he came back into focus, if that's a thing.
hmm.
Um, so and him trying to stop the bleeding, but of course he can't because Julian is a ghost and he
Right.
can't stop the bleeding. So I thought that was interesting how that worked. And then how his spirit, how the ghost was in pain.
Mm,
And I was trying to figure that out. And I'm like, if he's in pain, then maybe he's not dead.
hmm.
And I was like, as the story progressed, I was like, let Julian not be dead. I don't want him to be dead because I don't want him to be dead because I want them together.
Yeah.
I was already planning their future.
Yeah.
And then the second time he flickered out and didn't come back. I was like, so what happened? Did he release him? And but it didn't happen the way that
Hmm.
it was supposed to. And so I thought, okay, does Miguel have something to do with this? And I
Right.
mean, this is pretty late in the book.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about that, or I'm talking about it, let's just
Yeah.
go ahead and talk about Tio Catrice.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's get into it.
Because I I was all up on Tio Catrice as Like,
Like number one, yeah,
yeah,
ally,
like
yeah,
he's like the favorite uncle, and when he's talking about, oh, well, he didn't have the power, so or his power as a brujo was very weak, so he never
right.
had his quinces.
I
Kind of,
just figured it was like weak to the point of just not really being usable, probably.
yeah.
And I think that also speaks to like that idea of machismo within the Latina community, where it's
Hmm.
like, you have to be a certain level of strength or whatever to be
Right.
of value and to be of use or whatever. And so, like, that idea of like, if you're not strong enough, we're just going to sort of hide you away and
Hmm.
act like you don't exist, kind of thing.
And that was my conclusion, like before we got to the end, and he was
Hmm.
talking about they were had Yadriel and Catrice, they were in the garage, I think.
Hmm. Earlier,
It
yeah.
was fairly early on,
Yeah.
and they were having the conversation about that they didn't let him go through his quinces because of his power being too weak. And then
Right.
as the other pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, came together, that's what I figured. I figured that he was just not your typical or stereotypical um, masculine. Um, no, I don't want to say masculine. That's not the word that I
Yeah.
want. Your stereotypical strong, what we consider a male to be. I mean, you said it much more eloquently than I did.
I think it's interesting you say that because I think in some ways Catrice is not the stereotypical like masculine figure that you would expect him to be because he's considered to be a weak brujo. But at the
Mhm.
same time, he is a stereotypical sort of masculine person in that he is very insecure about his
Yeah.
masculinity and he's very fragile about his masculinity. And that's his whole thing, is that he wants to like actually enact violence on his own community as sort of a retribution for the things he felt he was owed as a man. And so he's going to sort of forcibly take away the power from his community so that he can have it for himself, which when you think about
Yeah.
it is like the most macho,
So,
like masculine, toxically masculine crap you could possibly imagine. So I think it's interesting that he does in some ways sort of defy it, but he
hmm,
also defines it as well
yeah.
in really interesting ways.
Yeah. But he's the archetype which we learn at the end that he's evil.
Right.
Or no,
He's the villain.
he's the villain, but what's the phrase? Power corrupts.
I have no idea.
Um, it's
Power.
old. Oh, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But his brother says it. What's his Enrique says
Yeah.
it that he was hungry for power.
Right.
I wonder if he was allowed to even do his quinces, if being a brujo, if he still would not have been corrupted
Hmm.
by the power that
Right.
he had.
Right. That's the question. Yeah. Hmm.
So he may have been corrupted because he wasn't able to have his quinces, and like you said, to be able to partake in that community,
Hmm.
um, and he was jealous of what was taken away, and it wasn't even taken away, it
Hmm.
was just never given.
Yeah. It was just denied
So
to him.
yeah, so if it was given, or if he was allowed to participate, would he have done right by it?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the interesting question. And I also think it's really interesting because obviously there's a sort of parallel between Catrice and Yadriel in that they are both brujos, but they're not technically seen as brujos by their community. And they've also been sort of ignored or outcast. And that's why they relate to each other so much. And I think it's really interesting because, like I said, Tio Catrice sort of represents the sort of toxically machismo path where it's like, I'm angry about the things that have been denied to me. I'm going to take them by force,
Hmm.
if I have to. And Gabriel is also masculine because he's a trans masculine person. He's sort of finding his own masculinity, and his masculinity is to find power from his community through togetherness and
Yeah.
by having them come together. That's where he wants to get his power from, and Catrice wants to take his power away from his community. So it's like they have similar trajectories, but they take very different paths. And I think, like you said, Catrice is more of a like subtractive mindset. That's what I'm going to call it, where it's like, I'm going to take things away and I'm going to enact violence on my community. And whereas Yadriel is more of an additive mindset, where it's like, I want to be seen and included in my community, and that's where my power is going to come from. So
Yeah.
it's like they're very similar parallels, but they make two very different choices, which is like what makes that relationship with them so dynamic, I think. And I also think it's really interesting that we can't even really call Catrice evil, right? Like he's
Yeah.
definitely the villain. He's definitely the antagonist. He's definitely the one doing something wrong,
Hmm.
but he still does love Yadriel. And like the things you see him do for Yadriel
Yeah.
are still good things, and there's still things he does because he loves Yadriel. He does genuinely want to help his nephew. So I think that's really interesting that like you can't really take those things away from him even after you know what you know by the end of the story. So
Hmm.
it's like you can't even really hate him, or you can't even really say that he's blanket evil, because
Right.
he's not. He is a person who has been harmed by his community, and who, like I said, wants to do unhealthy things to sort
Yeah.
of reckon with the things that were done to him or denied to him. So it's like you can't even really say that like he's like the bad guy or the bad
Right.
person. And I think it just goes to show that like the people who love you can still hurt you, which is,
Yeah.
I think, an overall theme in the story, with like
Mhm.
as we were talking about earlier, with like Yadriel's father and other people in his community who maybe misgender him or don't see him for who he is. Like, doesn't mean that they don't love him, they just don't know the right way to love him yet, kind of
Right.
thing.
And one of the things that I do remember notating in my book was generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because like Yadriel's mom
Mm-hmm.
was trying her best to
Mm-hmm.
break that
Right.
and to be supportive and to say, okay, this is who you are. I accept you for who you are, and trying to get everybody else on board
Mm-hmm.
with that. And then with Tio Catrice, excuse me, how the generational trauma was very much there, and he was very resentful. He was like, I was the firstborn, this was supposed to be mine, and it was denied, taken away, whatever
Mm-hmm.
from me, and that's not right. And I understand that, but it still does not give one the right
Right.
to do what he
Was
did
planning to do, yeah.
and was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and if he had succeeded in doing that, then the generational trauma would have continued, but
Mm-hmm.
it would have continued in a much darker way. I think that Yadriel's mom was the catalyst in making a change
Mm-hmm.
or starting the change
Mm-hmm.
in the community with him, and who knows how many other um, brujos, or what's the female bruja?
Bruja.
Bruja.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or Bruhex is just gender
Gender
inclusive.
neutral.
Yeah.
So they, how many, I mean, with that, now knowing that Yadriel's Portaje,
Portaja, yeah.
okay, has, and the Lady of Death, right,
Mm-hmm.
has accepted him as a brujo. So
Mm-hmm.
now knowing that, how many others in the
Mm-hmm.
community can now find their own way
Mm-hmm.
and find their path. Anything else you want to talk about? There's a lot that I want to talk
There's a
about, but
lot. I think something that really strikes me the most about Cemetery Boys is that it is a very trans story without necessarily being about transness or transition. And I think cis readers pick up on the surface level of it, where they're like, wow, this is an amazing story that's about a trans hero doing amazing things and like saving the day and like saving his community, right? Which it is. and it should be, I think, commended for that as well. But I think there's also this sort of almost subconscious arc that is so related to transness that a lot of people don't even really understand, or they can't really appreciate it the way it deserves. Because, like I said, I feel like the whole arc of the story is Gabriel going from a sense of being isolated in his own community to actually like being a part of his community, being an active part of his community in a way that is so specific to trans people. Like from the very beginning, when he had to do his quinces by himself,
Hmm.
and then when he had to hide the fact that he was a brujo from the rest of his family, that's like a very trans specific experience that I think a lot of cis readers can't pick up on,
Okay.
because when you are trans, you often do a lot of things by yourself. And those like really big milestones of like finding your identity are things that you do alone, things that you have to sort of come to peace with yourself before you can give it to anybody else. Whether it's like even just figuring out the fact that, oh, I am trans, or like, hey, this name is the one that I really like, or I think I use these pronouns, right? Like those are things you often figure out alone or with a very like small trusted few people, and then usually then you bring other people into it. So I think that is a really interesting sort of subliminal like sort of trans storyline within the
Hmm.
storyline of how Gabriel has to go through his ceremony alone. And then he has to hide the fact that he's a brujo from his family, because he doesn't think his family is ready to understand that
Hmm.
about him. They're not ready to accept that about him, even though he technically has the brujo magic. So he's like hiding his portaje. He's hiding the fact that he has Julian. And then going through the whole mystery and the adventure, going to the end where he does really reveal that about himself to his community. And they have to then contend with the fact that, oh, this thing that we didn't think was possible is actually possible.
Yeah.
And now we are being confronted with the reality of that, and we have to make space for that in our community. So I think there's this, like I said, sort of a subliminal, overarching, like transness to the story just inherently
Hmm.
that I think is really awesome and really meaningful for a lot of trans readers. And I think that's probably something they connect with when they read the story as well.
Yeah, I will agree. I noticed it, but hearing you talk about it, I'm like, that is I'm thinking about all of the subtleties
Mhm.
that were that were there in in the story regarding that, and I'm like 100%. I see it. I saw it, but I didn't see it.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, I see it a lot more clearly, which means I should probably go back and reread it. Towards the end, Gadriel's father says, "Our traditions have kept us from." And I remember writing in my book early on how traditions can be great, but they can also be a hindrance to moving
Hmm.
forward. In saying that, does that tradition also keep people down
Hmm.
and keep people from being their authentic selves?
Hmm.
And I think that that's very real in any community, that there's a tradition or traditions that we can't get past,
Hmm.
and we want to hold on to them for dear life because we feel as though if we don't hold on to it, then we're going to lose
Hmm.
who we are.
Hmm.
But the reality is, if you hold on to them without expanding your thought processes, you're still losing,
Hmm.
and you're not growing. So I've always said that traditions are meant to be built upon,
Right.
and that I don't want to say that the traditions that don't work for you today won't ever work, but if they are harming, then you have to figure out how to change that tradition, to build upon that tradition, to make it work. You don't have to
Hmm.
get rid of it. It's just a flaw in the
Hmm.
tradition.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of like we talked about earlier. I think tradition obviously is beautiful, and in stories like Cemetery Boys, it's even like sacred or magical to some extent. But people like to use tradition as a crutch.
Hmm.
They like to use it as an excuse. Well, this is the way it's always been. This is what I know. This is what I grew up knowing. This is what our family has grown up doing. And it's always been this way and it always will be this way. When that's not necessarily the case, right? And I think it's like you said, the point of Cemetery Boys, I guess, is to show that change is just a natural part of life. And
Hmm.
I think that's something a lot of people almost fear. I think they don't even understand. I think we get so caught up in being like, this is who I am right now, and that's how I want to stay.
Yeah.
Right. But, or we think that, I think that's what people fear about transness is that it shows in so many ways that change, right?
Yeah.
Because people, when people are trans, they change in some way, not necessarily physically, sometimes medically, sometimes socially, sometimes you change mentally, just the way you see yourself changes or the way you understand yourself changes. You don't necessarily have to change things about you, but transness represents change and it brings that change to the forefront and makes people have to contend with it in really immediate ways that makes them uncomfortable, when the truth is that change is just a part of life, because we all started out as a little baby, and then
Yeah.
you grow into an adult. You're always changing. Your body is changing, your life is changing, your relationships are changing, people are coming in and out of your life, the things you're interested in are changing, the maybe where you're working is changing.
Hmm.
Change is life. Life is change. You change from the moment you're born to the moment you die. So I think that is really what Cemetery Boys is celebrating, is the fact that change is part of life.
It's
Just like,
constant.
yeah, just like Gabrielle is changing throughout the story, and just like
Mhm.
Julian is changing throughout the story. Like, change the story, our story as we live
Hmm.
is to change.
Yeah. And that's very important because in my household, we say there's a season for everything.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
you just don't, people come into your life for a season,
Right.
and not everyone is meant to be there um, for forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that with Julian and especially with Yadriel,
Mm-hmm.
that they together discovered who they are
Mm-hmm.
during this time. And it wasn't easy for either one of them. And Yadriel even commented that, you know, um, Julian and his brother Rio are basically two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
They they love wholeheartedly and they give all of themselves to who they love.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, for Yadriel was very poignant, something to say to Julian because he didn't see that within himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't see that with his brother either. And having someone that can point those things out to you and help you come to realizations about who you are and even potentially your path
Mm-hmm.
is very, very important, even if they are a ghost. you know?
Yes, yes.
Um, so, and it's just really, it's a very, I think Cemetery Boys is a really important story um, for the trans community,
Mm-hmm.
for the cis het community. I think it is definitely something that needs to be read. Even if you don't um, understand, and I don't understand all of the things either, um, and I'm okay with saying that um, because it is a learning process. And I think having these discussions helps in the learning process. Did you have any closing remarks? Because I could talk on and on. There are lots of things that I want to say. But,
God, do I have any closing remarks? I don't know. Read Cemetery Boys. That's my takeaway from this. If you haven't, I don't know why you're
Yeah,
watching this if you haven't read Cemetery Boys, because we've spoiled it and gone all over it. But
yeah.
read Cemetery Boys.
We didn't talk about the ending though.
We
So,
didn't we didn't really. Did you want to talk about the ending? We talked a little, I mean, we talked about Caprice a little bit, but
yeah.
did you want to talk about the ending?
Um, the ending, I was like, even though I read it before, I was still saying, Maritza,
Hmm.
I need you to do your thing. So basically, should we just spoil the ending?
Let me sure we've come this far.
Okay. So basically, what happens is Tio Catrice tries to resurrect
Balam.
the Balam, and and then take over the basically take over the community and
Hmm.
avenge the avenge himself for not having his quinces or his his quinces.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a fail. But what we find out is that there's an old church that there's a an underground something cave
Tomb, like
tomb
catacomb.
thing, yeah. And what we find out is that Tio Catrice is responsible for the murder
Hmm.
of um,
Miguel
Julian, Miguel, and
and
two
two
others
others.
in order to try and do the resurrect the Balal.
Mhm.
Did I pronounce that correctly? Um,
Balam, yeah.
yeah, Balaam, and
Uh-huh.
and he ends up failing at it because Yadriel finds his strength,
Mhm.
and um, the jaguar comes up and takes Tio Catrice down to the underworld, and that's that. But Yadriel is not happy
Mhm.
because Julian is still dead, and he summons the Lady of Death. And what ends up happening is she says, well, there are consequences to your actions.
Mhm.
And he takes this amulet and puts it to his chest. And the Yadriel, not Yadriel, Julian, Miguel, and the other two that are in the catacombs, they are resurrected. They come back
Mhm.
to life, which is something that a brujo is not supposed to be able to do. But yep,
Yeah.
Yadriel has the power. And so Maritza is there as well. And she is like, I'm not letting you die on my watch, Yadriel. And she does her thing without using animal blood. And remember, we said that she was vegan.
Mhm.
So, my favorite, not my favorite, one of my favorite lines in here from her is she says, take that. And she
Mhm.
calls Lady of Death a bee. And I
Yep.
was like, oh. And so then at the end, at the very, very end, um, Yadriel and Julian are reunited and they are together. The scene on the hood of the car.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah.
That was amazing. So the scene on the hood of the car was where Julian and um, Yadriel kissed.
Mhm.
And by the way, um, Julian was still a ghost at the time, so I loved that scene.
It's my
That
favorites.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, that was another scene that made me kind of tear up. And when Julian in Yadriel's yearbook crossed out
Mhm.
his name and wrote Yadriel in
Mhm.
his yearbook,
Yeah.
that was another one. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, it's my heart. So yeah, thank you, Audrey.
Thank you.
But I appreciate you doing this with me. And
Yeah. Thank you so much for
um,
having me. I always love talking about Cemetery Boys.
I know. Oh, and by the way, if you are interested, and I will link the videos that Audrey has done on their channel in regards to Cemetery Boys, there is an interview with Aiden Thomas, and there is also a Cemetery Boys tag that Audrey created,
Mhm.
and what, 5 reasons why you should read Cemetery Boys. And I think there's another video too.
There's
I
so many more. Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I will link all of those videos in the description box below so you can go and check them out. And yeah, so definitely check out the interview. The interview is awesome. If you do nothing else, check out that interview, but I encourage you to watch all the videos. Plain and simple. So, all right, I appreciate you, Audrey. Thank you so much for joining me. And to those of you who are watching, thank you for watching and go read Cemetery Boys immediately.
Or reread it.
Or reread it, or reread it. So I appreciate it. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.